Margaret Green, 74, lived in a small cottage on the edge of the countryside, a place where time moved slowly, and every creak of the floor carried a memory. Her husband, Robert, had been gone for nearly a decade, yet his presence lingered in the framed photos, the teacups they once shared, and the soft hum of the radio she kept playing to fill the silence. Her greatest joy was Daniel, the son she and Robert had adopted when he was just a baby. She raised him with warmth, patience, and endless love. Now, Daniel was 36, living in the city, chasing success. Before he left, he handed her a small phone and said with a smile, "Mom, I'll call you every day. You'll never have to feel lonely." Every morning, she kept that phone beside her cup of tea, waiting for his voice, a voice that meant she still mattered. But sometimes, love keeps waiting long after the world grows quiet. At first, every day felt like sunshine. The little phone Daniel had given her was more than a gift, it was her lifeline. Each morning at exactly 8 o'clock, its cheerful ring filled the house. "Good morning, Mom," Daniel would say, his voice bright and full of life. Margaret would smile as she stirred sugar into her tea. "Good morning, my boy. Did you sleep well?" They spoke about everything: his new job, the traffic, the tiny dog he'd rescued from the street. Sometimes, he complained about deadlines or laughed about co-workers. Margaret listened, her heart swelling with pride. "Eat well, Daniel," she always reminded him. "Don't skip breakfast. You were always too thin as a child." He would chuckle. "Yes, Mom. I promise." Every conversation became a precious ritual. After hanging up, she wrote down what they had talked about in her diary, each page a memory, each entry sealed with a small heart. The phone sat beside her teacup every day, its black screen reflecting her gentle smile. Neighbors often stopped by and teased her kindly. "Your son must love you dearly, Margaret. You're lucky." She would nod proudly. "He calls me every day. Not one morning missed." But time, like a soft tide, began to shift. The calls that once came daily turned into every other day, then once a week. When she asked if everything was all right, Daniel laughed. "Just busy, Mom. You know how city life is." She understood. Or at least, she told herself she did. Then, one morning, the phone stayed silent. And the silence lasted longer than she ever imagined. Days melted into weeks, and the phone that once sang every morning now rested in perfect stillness. It sat on the kitchen table beside her teacup, quiet, unmoving, like a sleeping bird that had forgotten its song. Margaret checked it every few hours, pressing the buttons just to make sure it still worked. The small green light blinked faithfully. "Yes," she whispered, "it's not the phone. It's just a busy week." She tried to convince herself that Daniel's silence meant nothing. He was young. He had a job, friends, a life in the city. Still, each morning she brewed an extra cup of tea and waited. At 8 a.m., she'd glance at the clock. At 8:05, she'd sigh softly. By 9 o'clock, she'd tell herself, tomorrow. He'll call tomorrow. Nights were the hardest. Sometimes she would hold the phone close and speak to it quietly, as if her words could travel through the air. "I know you'll call soon, my dear," she murmured. "You always keep your promises." To fill the silence, she cooked his favorite dishes: tomato soup, buttered bread, and apple pie. She set the table for two, whispering a blessing before eating alone. The empty chair across from her seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Her neighbors noticed her solitude. "You should visit him, Margaret," one said kindly. She smiled. "Oh no. He's coming home soon. He said he would." Weeks slipped quietly into months. The garden bloomed, and the flowers she once tended with joy now felt like silent witnesses to her waiting. In her diary, she wrote letters she never sent. "Dear Daniel, the roses opened early this year. I made your favorite pie again. I miss your laughter in this house. Please call when you can. Love, Mom." When people asked about him, she lied, not out of pride, but out of love. "Oh yes, he calls often," she'd say with a soft smile. "He's doing so well in the city." But every night, when the village fell asleep, Margaret sat alone by the window, the dim light reflecting on the cold surface of the phone. Sometimes she thought she could almost hear it ring, but it was only the wind. Until one stormy evening, as thunder rolled across the hills and rain battered the roof, the phone finally rang. Margaret's heart stopped. Her trembling hands reached for it. "Daniel," she whispered. Her heart leapt as the phone finally rang. For a moment, time stood still. With trembling hands, Margaret lifted the receiver and whispered, "Daniel? Is that you?" But the voice that answered wasn't his. It was calm, professional, unfamiliar. "Good evening, ma'am. This is Dr. Lewis from St. Mary's Hospital. Are you Mrs. Margaret Green?" Her heart began to pound. Yes, that's me. Is my son all right? Is Daniel there with you?" There was a silence that spoke louder than any answer could. Then came the words that shattered her world. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Green. Your son passed away 2 months ago. There was an accident. We've been trying to reach you, but—" The rest of his words faded into nothing. The room blurred. The phone slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a soft thud. 2 months. For 2 long months she had waited by that phone, whispering his name, believing he had simply forgotten. All the while, her son had been gone. Margaret sank into her chair, staring blankly at the rain running down the windowpane. The storm outside mirrored the one inside her chest, violent, unrelenting, but soundless. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Her heart felt hollow, too heavy to beat. There were no screams, no tears, only a deep, aching stillness. After a while, she bent down and picked up the phone from the floor. The small screen still glowed faintly, waiting for another call. She pressed it gently to her chest and whispered, "I waited, Daniel. I really did." Hours passed. The storm eased, but Margaret didn't move. She sat in her chair, the glow of the phone lighting her face in the dark. Outside, the world went on. Cars passed, the rain stopped, dawn began to touch the horizon, but for Margaret, time had frozen. She finally understood why the silence had lasted so long, but knowing didn't bring comfort. It only deepened the emptiness that had already taken root. When the first light of morning entered the room, it fell across the phone lying beside her. Silent, still glowing softly, as if waiting for a call that would never come again. And in that quiet, Margaret whispered to no one, "Love doesn't die when someone leaves. It just learns to live in the silence." After the funeral, the house no longer felt like a home. It was just walls and air and echoes. The ticking of the clock grew louder, the whistle of the kettle sharper, and every creak in the wooden floor reminded her of footsteps that no longer came. Margaret moved through the room slowly, touching the furniture, the curtains, the old photo frames, as if each one still held a trace of her son's laughter. She couldn't bring herself to throw anything away. Not the half-finished puzzle Daniel had sent her last Christmas. Not the phone that once carried his voice. She placed it carefully beside Robert's photograph on the mantel. Robert, her late husband, smiling gently from another lifetime. Next to him, a framed picture of Daniel, young, bright-eyed, full of promise. Between the two photos, the little phone sat silently, its screen dark but charged every night. Every morning, Margaret brewed tea for 2 cups, the way she always had. She'd set them on the table and whisper, "Good morning, Robert. Good morning, Daniel." The steam would rise like a fragile prayer, disappearing into the quiet air. The neighbors sometimes visited, bringing soup or bread. They found her calm, even cheerful, though her eyes carried the weight of oceans. "She talks to them," one whispered. "Every day." Some called it grief. Others called it madness. But for Margaret, it was love, simple, faithful, unbroken. In her heart, she believed they hadn't left completely. They had just gone to a quieter place, where the line was still open. Where one day, when her time came, the phone would finally ring again, and she would answer. "I've been waiting, my loves. I never stopped." The seasons turned, and winter slowly loosened its grip. The days grew longer, and sunlight began to spill gently through Margaret's kitchen window once more. One morning, as she tended to her garden, a young woman appeared by the fence, bright eyes, warm smile. "Good morning. I'm Clara. I just moved next door," she said cheerfully. Margaret nodded politely, unsure how to respond. It had been a long time since anyone new had spoken to her. A week later, Clara returned with a basket of fresh muffins. "We're starting a community garden club," she said. "Would you like to join us? We could use your green thumb." Margaret hesitated. The thought of being around people again frightened her. But something in Clara's voice, gentle, patient, reminded her of Daniel. "All right," she said softly. "I'll come." That small decision changed everything. Every Thursday, Margaret joined the group at the park. She learned to plant roses, mix soil, and laugh again. They shared stories over tea, their hands dirty with earth but their hearts lighter than before. The garden became her new morning ritual, a place where life bloomed again, quietly and steadily. One afternoon, Clara found her sitting by a bed of tulips, smiling at the colors. "They're beautiful," Clara said. Margaret nodded. "Yes. They remind me that everything, even after the coldest winter, finds a way to grow again." In the evenings, when she returned home, the silence no longer felt heavy. She would make her tea, hum an old song, and gently touch the little phone by the photo frames. It no longer symbolized longing or sorrow. It had become something else, a reminder that love, once planted, never stops growing. She still charged the phone every night, not because she expected it to ring, but because she wanted to keep the connection alive. It was her quiet ritual of gratitude, a way of saying, "Thank you for loving me, wherever you are." And for the first time in a long while, when she looked at the world outside her window, Margaret didn't see emptiness. She saw light. She saw life. And in that light, she knew her story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about love that endures, even through silence. Years drifted by like petals carried on the wind. Margaret grew older, but her days were no longer lonely. Her cottage overflowed with laughter. Friends from the garden club visited often, children stopped by to listen to her stories, and letters filled her desk from people whose lives she had quietly touched. Yet one thing never changed, the little phone on her bedside table. It sat there, always charged, its soft light glowing faintly in the dark. One afternoon, a young visitor asked curiously, "Mrs. Green, why do you keep it on? It will never ring again." Margaret smiled, eyes warm with wisdom. "Maybe not," she said gently. "But it reminds me that love once called, and I answered. That's enough." Her words stayed with everyone who heard them. To some, she was the woman who waited too long. But to others, she was the woman who taught that waiting isn't weakness. It's proof that love, once real, never dies. When Margaret passed away peacefully one spring morning, the phone was still beside her, charged and glowing, a symbol of eternal connection. In her garden, the flowers she had planted bloomed brighter that year. And those who knew her would often whisper, "She never stopped loving."